Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Stone Chapel Podcast. My name is David Capes. I've always admired Scott Hafemann. I read his book on Paul and Moses many moons ago when I was working on some ideas from 2 Corinthians. At any rate, I became a fan of his, and he joins me today on the Stone Chapel Podcast to talk about Paul and his letters. Now, the Stone Chapel Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. This network is dedicated to providing resources for church leaders to help them chart a course for their congregations during these challenging times. The Lanier Library, who sponsors this podcast, wants us to dive deeply into theology and Scripture to help us think more authentically about the work to which we're called. You can learn more about that at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. Scott Hafemann taught at Wheaton College. That's where and when I got to know him. But his last academic post before retirement was at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Recently, he was at the Lanier Theological Library to help teach a course for our Lanier Certificate in Theology and Ministry. It's a program for lay people and church leaders seeking some informal theological education, but you'd be amazed at the lineup that we've put together for that program. You can read more about that on our website at laniertheologicallibrary.org. It was a delight to welcome my friend and colleague Scott Hafemann to our campus, and it was a joy to have him for the first time on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Hello, my name is Scott Hafemann, and I am the retired reader in New Testament from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland.
Dr. Scott Hafemann, good to see you. Welcome to the Stone Chapel Podcast.
It's great to be seen.
Yeah, you're right here in our fair city, and you're here at the Lanier Theological Library. So glad that you're here to teach a course for us. We'll say more about that in a moment. But for those who don't know you, who are you?
Well, I guess you start at the beginning. And when I think about how I got interested in Paul the Apostle, whom we'll be talking about in a few minutes, I can think back to when I became a Christian back at the end of the Jesus movement through a coffeehouse ministry, Jesus People USA in Chicago, Illinois. And one of the first things the coffeehouse folks did after you gave your life to Christ was they hand you a Bible and ask you to start reading it. And I can remember reading the Apostle Paul. I didn't know anything about who Paul was or anything about the New Testament, but I can remember asking myself, who is this guy? Where did he come from? And what happened to him? And that's the beginning.
Yeah, so that's pretty early on then.
Yeah, that's right. I was 18 years old.
Billy Graham in those days would give out the Gospel of John, but you ended up starting with Paul, it sounds like.
Well, yes, because the folks that led me to Christ were of a particular dispensational persuasion, and they believed that the epistles were the ones that were most relevant for the church.
Oh, I see.
And so you didn't start with the Gospels. You started with the epistles.
Started with Paul. Now, you've taught at St. Andrews, and you've taught at Wheaton College. Where did you do your education?
I went to three colleges, universities, but I graduated from a small Baptist school in Minnesota called Bethel College, now Bethel University. And from there, I ended up graduating from Fuller Theological Seminary, Pasadena, California, though I did a third of my seminary work also at Bethel Seminary and Luther Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities. And then I did some further work at the University of Minnesota. I had to learn Latin in order to get into my PhD program, so I did that. And then eventually went off to the University of Tübingen in Germany, of course, where I did my PhD.
And Tübingen has had such a great history of turning out some wonderful scholars over the years. And so we're just so grateful that you're here to talk about Paul and his letters with our students. So you're teaching a course for our Lanier Certificate in Theology and Ministry. It's a new program for us. We've got 40 students ready to go. They're all mostly lay people, but we are just so excited to be able to share a little bit and give a preview of what a course like this might look like for our students. You've got 4 sessions that you're going to be doing. How are you going to start tonight?
Well, when I was thinking about the class, As you know, there's a couple of ways you can introduce Paul to people. You can do the survey of his epistles, look at his 13 letters and ask the questions of who, what, when, where, and why. To be honest, I find that actually really boring. And if students are interested in the history of Paul or tracing out his 3 missionary journeys or looking at the structural analysis of the 13 letters, there are so many good resources out there that they can turn to do such things. So instead, I decided that I would focus in on who Paul is as he understood himself and what were the essential salient points of his theology. So in the 4 sessions, I'm going to treat not a survey of his letters in general, but look very specifically at his self-understanding and at the 2 pivotal points of his theology.
To be fair, you've spent a lot of time reading Paul, writing about Paul, researching Paul. I have too. I've written on Christology. You can spend years doing this work. So you've got to try to boil it down in just a few hours to some salient, relevant things for people in their lives today. I know you're going to talk a little bit about covenant. Let's go a little bit into that.
Okay. To get there, I'm going to start in the first session to ask the question, how did Paul understand himself? And what is a Pauline epistle as a reflection of Paul's own ministry? And in order to answer those questions, I'm going to look at 2 things that he said about himself, namely his apostolic authority as it was unpacked in terms of his self-understanding as a servant of the new covenant, a slave of Christ, and an apostle of the Lord. And hence, so we'll look at his authority as a follower of Christ and as an apostle and see how that impacts his understanding about the role of his letters. And then the second thing we're going to look at is the way in which Paul understood the character of his life as a servant of the new covenant. And so there we'll look at the contours of his gospel on the one hand and the contours of his ministry, his servanthood of the new covenant on the other hand, and ask what's the relationship between the gospel of God from Isaiah and Paul's own understanding of the gospel of Christ and his understanding of what's new in the new covenant in relationship to the old covenant and the history of Israel. So we're going to be finally then climaxing in the way in which all of these aspects of Paul's life, his authority as servant, slave, and apostle, his understanding of the gospel and the new covenant, find their apex in, surprisingly, his call to suffer. And ask then, why did Paul actually suffer so much as the embodiment of his message?
That is not a message that people talk about a lot with Paul. I mean, they do, but we want to hear happy things about Jesus and being happy in Jesus and being all things working together for good.
All things work together for good to those who love God.
Yes.
We always want to be on that positive side.
Yeah.
But Paul, it seems, sought out ways in which to suffer.
Yeah. And I mean, even more, I think, shocking to us, he felt that he was called to suffer and that God orchestrated the circumstance of his life to bring him into situations of suffering and to do so as an example to his people. So I think Paul understood that he was called to suffer in order to embody the message that he preached, so that whenever his people did suffer circumstantially, they would be able to see what the power of the gospel looked like embodied in his own perseverance in the midst of adversity. So that the gospel he preached is embodied in the life he lived as a suffering servant of Christ, just as Christ himself was the suffering servant of the Lord. So rather than calling his gospel into question, Paul's suffering actually was the very enfleshment or embodiment of the gospel itself. And I'm going to try to show students how he unpacks that in his writings.
One of the things that we find in the teaching of Jesus is an expectation that his followers will suffer. And often that is in the realm of persecution, social estrangement, and in some cases ostracism from the community. In Paul's case, the traveling that he did was not easy. It was difficult. He ended up in shipwrecked. He ended up being beaten. He ended up in prison in a number of cases. And he details those things. And in a way, I don't want to say boast in them, but maybe he does, doesn't he? He boasts in his suffering.
Yeah, he surely did. And underlying all these circumstantial sufferings that he endured because of his apostolic ministry, like you mentioned, from his travels to his imprisonments, there was the underlying constant affliction, thorn from the evil one, as he calls it, given to him by our sovereign God, that I think was relentless migraine headaches.
Really?
Yeah, there's been some more recent studies on the medical terminology that Paul uses in describing the thorn in the flesh when he talks about it as a hammer that used to buffet his head. And folks have seen from ancient medical textbooks that language was used to describe debilitating migraine headaches. And my wife suffered from those for years and was hospitalized with them. And I know, therefore, just how painful and debilitating they are. In other words, there were times when people with these kinds of migraines would lose their eyesight, would become paralyzed, would, of course, be so sick that they would be vomiting and then not be able to collect their thoughts. And the only thing they can do is, especially if you're thinking in the first century without medicine,
Right.
is just hold on for dear life until the headache would pass. And Paul talked about the fact that the Lord had granted him that thorn in the flesh in order to keep him humble in light of the amazing revelations of the gospel that he had received. And you might remember, going to this in the class, but it just comes to mind, I should say this, that on the flip side, of course, when the super apostles were bragging about their own spiritual experiences and critiquing Paul because they thought he suffered too much to be an apostle of the resurrected Christ, Paul finally had to trump their boasting with his own description of the time when the Lord took him in a vision up to his own presence in the third heaven. What's amazing to me is that happened in Paul's life 14 years before he ever told a single person about it. I mean, if that happened to me, I'd be talking about it tomorrow morning, right?
Exactly.
He waited 14 years, and he only did it in the third person when he was forced to do it because of the boasting of his opponents. Of course, that's the text and the context from which we learn about his thorn in the flesh, right? And how's this for counterculture? When he comes back out of his vision and he reports what he saw and learned in the Lord's presence in the third heaven, the only thing he said was, God said no to my prayers. You get to go into God's presence, and the one thing you hear is no.
No.
I.e., I'm not going to take away your suffering.
Right.
Because my power is made perfect in your weakness.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, he asked 3 times, and then it seems as if he never asked again. Do you think he was thinking about Jesus in the garden at that point? We don't know that he's had a record of that, but Jesus asked 3 times, Father, let this cup pass from me. And God said no to that. And now he is before God, and he's asking God 3 times, God, is there any way you can let this thorn in the flesh pass from me? And God said no.
That's a great parallel. And students of the text have wondered, why 3? Why not 5? Why not 2? Why don't you just ask once?
Right.
I think the best answer I've heard, this is not unique to me, but from what I've studied, is that there's a tradition of praying 3 times for things because it symbolizes the beginning, the middle, and the end. So it's a way of talking about you've prayed it out, you've prayed it through. There's nothing more to ask. You started, you went through the middle, and you finished. And so 3 was a way of talking about the completion of the prayer.
So not necessarily strictly those 3 times.
It might not have been 3 times, but it could have been. In other words, if you prayed 3 times, that should be sufficient.
Right.
Because it should be the beginning, middle, and the end of your concerns.
Right. And are you going to be satisfied after that 3rd with God's answer?
Right.
Or in some cases, a non-answer, or that kind of thing.
That's right.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway.
So what has the study of Paul meant for you personally as you think about your own life as a professor, as a Christian, as a father?
Well, I think this comes back to actually what I'm going to talk about in the third session related to Paul's suffering, and that is the question, what's new in the new covenant? And what's been most impactful in my life is to see that for Paul, what's new in the new covenant is not a new message. The gospel he preaches is the gospel that's been preached from Genesis on, but was the promise from God that under the new covenant, God was going to match the proclamation of his word with the transforming power of his Spirit for all those whom he was bringing into his people. Because you remember, under the old covenant, Israel often got the word, the Torah, without the Spirit. And so it just condemned them, and because they didn't keep it, of course. So the promise of the new covenant is that you're going to get the law with the Spirit, the message of God with the Spirit, so that he will be enabling you to actually fulfill his will, to keep his commandments. And so I think what's been most impactful in my life is to recognize that trusting in God's promises always expresses itself in obedience to God's commandments because of the empowerment of the Spirit. So that I can never claim to be trusting God's promises, even the promise of forgiveness at the cross, if I'm not expressing that trust and obedience to God's commands. Because obedience, for Paul, is simply trust gone public. Just like disobedience is distrust gone public, right? So, I mean, the classic example would be, if you're trusting God to meet your needs for tomorrow, then you don't steal today, right? But if you say, well, I trust God to meet my needs, but I'm stealing, it's a contradiction in terms, right? It's an impossibility. It's cognitive dissonance. To trust God to meet your needs would mean not to steal. But actually even means more than that, because a command like thou shalt not steal from the Ten Commandments, all of the commandments of God for Paul are symbols pointing to a reality beyond themselves, right? So that when the reality comes, you don't need the symbol anymore. So the reality for not stealing is obviously trusting God to meet your needs in such a way that, as Paul tells the thief, stop stealing, get a job so that you might give to others. He tells them.
That's completely now. That's
right?
a new wrinkle.
So instead
to
of
it.
taking from others, the fulfillment of that command is to give to others. The challenge of it is to recognize then that if I'm following Christ and if his presence through the Spirit is a reality in my life, then the expectation is that I will actually be obedient to his commandments as I trust his provisions. And so that's, I think, the most impactful thing, because when I see myself disobeying, I don't try to screw up more willpower and say, oh, I just have to obey. No, it's not a self-help program in any way. It's not the power of positive thinking. It's not willpower. It's what promise of God am I not trusting that's manifesting itself in this disobedience? And what do I need to trust God for that I wouldn't do this again? And so that link in Paul's theology between trusting God's promises as they themselves are expressed in obedience is the most impactful thing. Because before I was studying Paul in detail, I was taught by well-meaning Christians, don't get me wrong, but I was taught that there were two things you had to do to be happy in Jesus, as we used to sing way back in the 70s. You had to trust and obey,
right?
For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey, as if the life of faith consisted of two things.
Right.
And believing wouldn't be enough. You'd have to believe and obey. But then, of course, somehow, why should I obey if I already believe? It was just a complete confusion to me. But now I realize that there's only one thing you need to do to be a Christian, and that is trust, obey. In other words, you just work on trusting God and watch the way in which, as you study his word, that trust is to be manifested in obedience to his commandments. So we're not trying to add obedience to the life of faith. We're simply strengthening our life of faith and watching the way it expresses itself in obedience. So that's how I think the commands work.
Yeah.
The commands are all calls to trust God. The commands of God are simply the promises of God in disguise.
I like it. I haven't heard it put that way before exactly. Fantastic. Dr. Scott Hafemann, thanks for being with us today on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Yeah, well, and let me just say thanks for inviting me to teach this course on Paul and his letters in the LCTM certificate program that you've got off the ground now. And to all the listeners out there, come on over.
Do it. Come on over. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Many thanks again to Dr. Scott Hafemann for being with us on the podcast. I hope he's back soon to teach another class for the Lanier Certificate in Theology and Ministry. Hey, we have some new listeners in Singapore. We want to welcome them especially. Please tell your friends and family about us. Thanks to Phil Kecke and David Capes for our music. Thanks to the wonderful and wise Kathy Capes for editing this podcast. A special thanks to Jana Firestone and Jessica Mauser for all of their help in producing this podcast that's coming your way. Please hit that subscribe button and join us weekly on Tuesday mornings when this podcast drops. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks.